Hey everyone, welcome to Online Education Academy ZA. On today's lesson, we'll be learning about computer generations. Right, the generation of computers. So computer generations from 1950 till present times. Right, so computers built after 1950 more or less follow the von Neumann model. So the ones that are built after 1950, they follow the von Neumann model. They have become faster, smaller, and cheaper. So computers are getting smaller and smaller. Even you can see they are getting thinner and thinner, but the principle is almost the same. Because from the time when computers were designed, they were using vacuum tubes, right, which were big, and they were getting and they were costly. They were very expensive. So the transition, the change when scientists made a finding of founding transistors. Transistors were very smaller compared to the vacuum tubes, and they lasted longer, and they could reduce their size. So now that's why using transistors, now computers are getting smaller and smaller, almost the same. Historians divide this period into generations, with each generation witnessing some major change in hardware or software, but not in the model. Not in the model, like how it works, like, because they still follow the von Neumann model, right? So the hardware has changed, but the computer's functionality is still the same, where you have input, output. We have input, output, right? And then in between we are having the CPU, we are having the place where you calculate your algorithm, right? Those are the things that you have. The pieces of software and hardware is still the same, and still follow the same principle of the von Neumann model. But historians divided this period into generations, which each generation witnessing some major change in hardware or software, but not in the model. The first generation, roughly 1950 to 1959, is characterized by the emergence of commercial computers. It's when commercial computers emerged. During this time, computers were used only by professionals. They were used only by professionals because they were expensive. They were locked in rooms with access limited only to the operator or computer specialist, right? So they were operated by an operator of the computer or computer specialist. Computers were bulky and used vacuum tubes. This first generation is the one that used vacuum tubes. So a computer could fill a large room. Vacuum tubes and electronic switches. At this time, computers were affordable only by big organizations. It's only big companies which could afford these computers. And the storage, it requires a large storage, because the computer was a big machine, right? In this generation, where vacuum tubes were used as electronic switches. So they were used as electronic switches. And then we have the second generation. Second generation computers, roughly 1959, the period from 1959 to 1965, used transistors. So during this period, they developed transistors instead of vacuum tubes. So vacuum tubes were replaced by transistors, which then, because in their size transistors were smaller, they can then reduce some of the hardware in that computer to make the computer quite small. This reduced the size of computers as well as their cost. So now they cost less. They reduced the size and cost, and made them affordable to small and medium-sized corporates. Now small and medium-sized corporates could afford these computers. Two high-level programming languages, Fortran and COBOL, okay, were invented and made programming easier. These two languages separated the programming task from the computer operation task. A civil engineer for example, could write a Fortran program to solve a problem without being involved in the electronic details of computer architecture. So, like now, during this generation now, they could write programs without being involved in the architecture, in the way the computer is manufactured. They could write code now, which means at this time they started writing code, because during the first generation now they were using those switches to store data in it. Now during this, when the programming language Fortran and COBOL were introduced in the second generation, now a civil engineer now could write programs without changing the hardware of the computer, without being involved in the hardware, in the architecture of the computer. Then we witnessed then third generation. This was the second generation, right? Third generation, the invention of the integrated circuit. During this generation now, it's when there was an invention of the integrated circuit, transistors, wiring, and other components on a single chip. Now they integrated everything, the transistors, the wiring, on a single chip. Now they put all those things in a chip, so they could reduce the size and cost again, reduce the cost and size of computers even further. Now they reduce them even further because now they were getting smaller, because a single chip now will host those transistors, is integrated now in a circuit, right? So that is called a single chip in a chip, which a chip is quite small, but now they put all the important components that in the chip that allows the functionality of the computer, reduce the cost and size of computers even further. Many computers appeared on the market. Canned programs, popularly known as software packages, became available. A small corporation could buy a package. A small corporation could buy a package, for example, for accounting, instead of writing its own program. A new industry, the software industry, was born. So the software industry was born during this time, right? When the computers were developed, now they were chips were introduced. Now everything, those transistors were integrated in a circuit, right? The wiring, transistors, wiring, and other components. So in that thing, we call it a single chip. In just one chip, they were integrated. The brain of a computer was there in that one chip, right? So during the other generation, it required a lot more than that. Okay, so a software industry was born. This generation lasted roughly from 1965 to 1975. Right. Then after the time from 1965 to 1975, we experienced the fourth generation. The fourth generation, approximately 1975 to 1985, saw the appearance of microcomputers. The first desktop calculator, the Altair 8800, became available in 1975. Advances in the electronic industry allowed the whole computer subsystem to fit on a single circuit. So the whole computer subsystems, which is the CPU, which is the controls, the input and the output, input, process, output, CPUs, everything could fit now in a single chip, in a single circuit board. This generation also saw the emergence of computer networks. Now computer networks emerged in this generation. Fifth generation, this is the generation we are in, the fifth generation of computers. This open-ended generation started in 1985. It has witnessed the appearance of laptops and palm-top computers, improvements in secondary storage media, CD-ROM, DVDs, and so on, right? And even now, CD-ROMs and DVDs are getting outdated now. Computers are now using USB ports without space to put CDs now. So on the use of multimedia and the phenomenon of virtual reality. Virtual reality now, we are in that, right? So these are the generation of computers that we experience from the first generation to the fifth generation. Thank you very much for your time. Don't forget to subscribe.